Hello, Potomac Crossing Ward. We are doing 2020 Come Follow Me Lesson 32, which is Alma 53 through 63. And this is covering a lot of the war chapters, the second half of the war chapters. Um, so I'm going to do some general comments on 53 through 63, and then I'm going to do some comments on Alma 54, and then I'm going to do some comments on Alma 56 through 58. So I'm going to skip around a little bit, hit some stuff, so this will be a little bit longer than usual, I think. So general comments on 53 through 63. In the last section of text, chapters 43 through 52, we saw the theme of conflict between Moroni and various apostate Nephites. Here that theme continues with some additional Nephite dissensions occurring in Moroni's absence. So we see Moroni versus Amaron, which is continued in 53 through 55. Nephite dissensions in Moroni's absence in 53, 8 through 9. Kingmen revolt again in Moroni's absence, 61 through 3 through 8, verses 3 through 8. Moroni versus the Kingmen, 62, 7 through 11. Moroni versus Amaron, the finale, in 62, 12 through 37. And Moroni versus the Lamanites in 62, 38. Then the book of Alma closes with Moroni's son Moroni-ha in a conflict with yet another group of apostate Nephites who inspired the Lamanites to war. So we see Moroni-ha versus the Lamanites in 63, 14 through 15. One of the new interesting features we see in these chapters is several exchanges of letters which are documented in the text. So we have a letter, or possibly a letter, of Amaron to Moroni in 54:1. It's not clear if that's a letter or if it's simply verbally communicated by the courier. Then we have a letter, definitely a letter, from Moroni to Amaron in 54:5 through 14, and a response letter from Amaron to Moroni, 54:16 through 24. Helaman to Moroni, chapters 56 through 58. Moroni to Pahoran, 59:3. Then we have Moroni to Pahoran, chapter 60. Pahoran to Moroni, chapter 61. And then a Nephite, quote, king to the Lamanite king, 61:8. Now there are written edicts sent among the Nephites from time to time prior to this. For example, Mosiah 2:8, Mosiah 27:2, and Mosiah 29:4. But this is the first time in the Book of Mormon where we have written correspondence going back and forth between different people. And there are, subsequent to this, there are a number of references to letters being written. So one would assume at some point the antiquity of the letters would result in them being lost due to decay if they were not included in the plates. But this wouldn't seem to be the case. In the present text, as the letters that Mormon is quoting, apparently verbatim, are well over 300 years old, it doesn't seem likely that the letters were that old. Likely that letters that old would survive if they weren't in the plates. So I think it's safe to assume that those letters ended up being inscribed into the large plates, and then Mormon used that. We might also speculate that the appearance and persistence of letter writing is indicative of some kind of institutional or technological shift in the Nephite culture, so that it became commonplace where previously it was uncommon. Another thing suggesting a kind of institutional shift in writing is Helaman's having the engraved scriptural record being written down and sent among all the Nephites, and we see that in 63:12. This is the first explicit mention of widespread public access to the scriptures. There are implicit statements prior to this, like, for example, Jacob 7:23, Alma 13:20, Alma 14:1, Alma 14:8, Alma 17:2, Alma 33:3. But it's never clear how widespread or public the access was to the written scriptures. And we simply don't know how widespread literacy was among this population. So perhaps there's some technological innovation that enables easier production of ink and writing material at this time. Because it's clear that things change in the letter writing and the between people, and then the written scriptures being published and widespread. That's a definite change that previous to this, it's just not present in the text previous to this. Okay, so that wraps up that set of general comments. Okay, so I wanted to make some comments on Alma 54. So this is the correspondence between Ammoron and Moroni. And I think this chapter in particular merits a close reading because of what's going on in the text. So this chapter recounts an exchange of letters between the military leaders of the warring Nephites and Lamanites. The interesting and, dare I say, entertaining thing in these letters is the complete lack of decorum in trading insults, which appears to have been started by Moroni. Moroni insults the Lamanites as being squatters in what is originally Nephite land. We see that in verse 6 and 12. He then threatens them with taking it back from them by force in verse 13. He insults Ammoron personally by labeling him an apostate in verse 8, calls him a child of hell in verse 11, and a murderer in verse 13. Ammoron responds in kind by calling Moroni a murderer in verses 16 and 22, accuses the Nephites of not following the traditional norms of patriarchal government in verse 17, mocks Moroni for what he considers feeble threats in verse 19, and insults the Nephites for being kidnappers in verse 23. To top it all off, Moroni gets angry at Moroni's response. We see that in 55:1. Well, I mean, honestly, Moroni, what do you expect when you call someone an apostate, murdering child of hell? I mean, that's, even if Moroni was an apostate, murdering child of hell, and it certainly looks like he was, you don't get very far negotiating with people like that when you point out to them that that's what they are. It doesn't matter if it's true if you end up with a negative outcome, right? I mean, if your goal is to negotiate in good faith to get a favorable outcome, and you just insult the person, then that's bad diplomacy. And even still, Ammoron agreed to Moroni's condition to turn over the whole family, which is something that Moroni requested. But Moroni still refuses because he's angry about Ammoron's lies and false justifications. Well, what do you expect from an apostate murdering child of hell? An apology? I mean, overall, this is not an effective attempt at diplomacy. Now, when historians look at people in retrospect, Abraham Lincoln gets a lot of attention for his extraordinary facility at writing in a very diplomatic manner, despite some very difficult circumstances. Moroni and Lincoln are clearly opposites. Moroni seems to me more like a George S. Patton sort of guy. While Moroni was a military genius, he was a diplomatic failure. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. Now, aside from the matter of diplomacy, the correspondence is an enlightening look at the psychology of these two men. Both Moroni and Ammoron present logical arguments with merit when judged superficially, and to their respective followers, the arguments would have been persuasive. So, I mean, Mormon presents a series of arguments, and then Ammoron presents a series of arguments, and both arguments are well thought out and are clearly presented. I mean, even Ammoron's response, he presents a series of logical arguments. You could disagree with the logic, but the fact is he presents a series of logical arguments, and the people who he's trying to persuade would clearly find those arguments to have merit. It seems likely in Ammoron's case that his arguments reflect the propaganda that the apostate Nephites are using on the Lamanites to whip them up to anger to prepare for and keep them in a war with the Nephites. Mormon preserves Amoron's jingoism, shedding light on how false justifications are used to promote anger, hate, and war. So I think going back and reading that letter very carefully, and not just kind of tearing through it, if you look at the psychology that is behind these letters and what they really represent, as far as your rhetoric and your wartime, um, oh, the word is escaping me, the rhetoric, propaganda, your wartime propaganda. Um, these two letters kind of preserve that wartime propaganda that is being used among these two populations to justify what's happening, uh, in the discussion with these people. And I think that's what Mormon is including here, is he's giving us insight into their psychology, he's giving us insight into their wartime propaganda, and he's explaining the rationale behind what's driving these people. Okay, so I would encourage you to go back and take a close look at what these guys are saying. It's more than just personal insults. It's laying that wartime propaganda out to justify their actions. Okay, so general comments on Alma 56 through 58. So this is the set of letters that Helaman writes to Moroni, talking about what happens as he is leading the stripling warriors into battle. And Helaman writes these series of letters to Moroni to let him know what's going on, and also to inform him of the battlefield situation. Like, he informs Moroni about which cities have been lost and then recaptured, and kind of where the lay of the battlefield is. And then at the end of the letter, he makes the request about soldiers. He's like, "Look, we need more soldiers and provisions. What's going on?" Um, but I think there's more to it than that. In the Old Testament accounts of the wars of Israel versus the various Gentile nations, there are miraculous accounts of acts of nature and internal conflict, where the Lord is causing internal conflict on the part of the Gentiles who are going to attack the Israelites, so that the Israelites don't even have to go into battle. Either the Gentile nations end up fighting each other and killing each other, or there's some kind of trickery or deception involved, where the foreign armies, the Gentile armies, are tricked or are just simply caused to panic. We don't see any of that kind of stuff in these chapters. In these later chapters of Alma, where we have these wartime conflicts, it's a very different setting. These accounts of Lamanite versus Nephite wars are just the opposite. It's grueling hand-to-hand combat with no miraculous events preserving and protecting one side. Well, why? It's Israel versus Israel, right? The Nephites and the Lamanites are both Israel. So this isn't the Lord's covenant people versus the Lord's non-covenant people. All of these people are the Lord's covenant people, and all of them are really having problems. I mean, the wars here are the Nephites versus apostate Nephites who have enlisted Lamanites to attack the apostate Nephites, and the Lamanites who have repented and become anti-Nephi Lehis. So this is kind of this big ugly churn of apostasy. So the Nephite apostates get the Lamanites to attack the Nephites, who are themselves not doing all that well, as the Nephites are themselves dealing with internal dissensions and strife. Like, you've got the kingmen and these other problems that the Nephites are dealing with. Now, the one exception during these war chapters is the 2,000 stripling warriors, the sons of the anti-Nephi Lehis, who were formerly Lamanites, go into battle so their fathers do not have to break their oath to renounce their warlike behavior. Helaman, who's the high priest, talks the fathers out of breaking their oath. So remember that the fathers were like, hey, we can see that the Nephites are having problems with the Lamanites, so we're going to break our oath and take up our weapons again and go and defend the Nephites against the Lamanite incursion. But Helaman talks them out of it. He says, no, we don't want you to do this. This is bad, so don't do it. But they have these sons who then take up the sword and shield in defense of their new land, the Nephites. So this zealous group of converts weigh into combat and win every battle without casualty, exhibiting exceptional faith. Among the righteous Nephites, these events would have been seen as evidence the Lord was on their side, and as examples of the kind of faith they need to have to be supported by the Lord in their battle against the apostate Nephites and Lamanites. So when these three chapters are presented as Mormon quoting verbatim a letter from Helaman to Moroni, wherein Helaman is recounting his experiences with the stripling warriors, focusing on the military success they've experienced as a result of the exceptional faith of the boys and the miraculous protection they've enjoyed as a result. And then Helaman closes the letter with a tacit request for military assistance, which then transitions into Moroni's letter to Pahoran for additional assistance, which we see in the beginning of chapter 59. Okay, so the way that the Helaman's letter is written to Moroni, the first chunk of text, the several 15 or 20 verses, is Helaman recounting all of the events that led up to Helaman leading the 2,000 stripling warriors. And so that chunk of text it's just riddled with parenthetical comments where Helaman is inserting all of these parentheses in order to explain the context of what's happening, and well, this happened, and then this happened, and then this is related to this, and then this thing happens, and then that. So Moroni very likely knew all of this stuff already. So Helaman is not informing Moroni of these events through parenthetical statements. Helaman very likely knows that this letter is going to get spread around through the Nephites, through the church, to the anti-Nephi Lehis, so that they know how their sons are doing, because this is the kind of faith-promoting content and the faith-promoting text that you are going to want to spread around through the Nephites when they are facing, a war which is an existential threat. Helaman is the high priest. He's not. There's nothing really to suggest that Helaman is a military leader. The anti-Nephi Lehis, the sons of these guys, the 2,000 stripling warriors, select him as their leader, and it's pretty clear that they don't intend to go into battle. Helaman's goal is to just kind of use them as reinforcements and assisting in labor, carrying provisions. His intent is to keep them out of war because he doesn't want them killed. So Helaman is acting as their leader, but not really as a military leader. It's more of kind of a spiritual leader, and they select him that way, and that's what it suggests, is because Helaman talked their fathers out of taking arms up, and then the sons say, well, hey, Helaman, we want you to be our leader. But it's pretty clear that Helaman is not acting as a military leader. He is acting still in the capacity of high priest. So as the high priest, he wants to convey this spiritual message. So he's writing this letter to Moroni that contains this extraordinary story about how this group of young men, the stripling warriors, likely all teenagers, right? These are pre-adult, so who knows, 14 to 16, 14 to 17, 14 to 18. These are young guys. They're probably adult sized, because the Lamanite spies see them and just assume that they're warriors. They don't recognize that they're teenagers, so they're probably adult sized, but still they're quite young. Um, and they want Helaman to be the leader, and so Helaman's goal here clearly is to convey a spiritual message that is going to be spread abroad through the Nephites and back to their parents, the anti-Nephi Lehi's, letting them know that if they are this faithful and this zealous and they have this kind of extraordinary conviction, that they can win and the Lord will support them and the Lord will protect them, so that they win against the Lamanites. So it's clear that Helaman is writing this to convey a spiritual message. This is not just a battlefield military intelligence report. This is a spiritual message that was intended to be conveyed to all of the Nephite population in general, to bolster their testimonies, to bolster their conviction to fight this war, and to strengthen their conviction that the Lord is on their side and supporting them. You can see through the text also, as you're reading these chapters, that the Lamanites are killing prisoners and the Nephites are not killing prisoners. And the Nephites refuse to just execute prisoners, and this becomes kind of a running problem, because they have to guard the prisoners, and then the prisoners break out and cause problems, and it's really a hassle dealing with all these prisoners, where the Lamanites just simply execute them. Again, that's going to be another message that will be conveyed to the Nephites, saying, look, we are civilized. We are not monsters. We treat these Lamanites well, because we value life and we take our religion seriously. So there's a lot of subtleties in the text that are intended to convey this spiritual message and to prop up the Nephite point of view and let them know that if they are zealous and they are keeping the commandments and trusting in the Lord, that they will be preserved and protected. So that's some of the spiritual stuff. As we're going through these wartime texts, we should ask ourselves, in this wartime setting, where does the religion come through? Where are these messages coming in through the combat footage? Where are we seeing the spiritual, the sun breaking through the clouds and conveying that spiritual message? Because it's there. It's absolutely there. And we should not skip over it. We should read this text and say, yes, Mormon was a military dude who liked military things, but he was a spiritual guy too, who was trying to convey a spiritual message. So as we read through these wartime chapters, look for the spiritual stuff and ask yourself the question, what is the message, the spiritual message that Mormon is trying to convey to me in these wartime texts? Because it is not just a matter of Mormon writing down a military history. These chapters are very much about the Nephites' spiritual history as well, and how that spiritual history is wound together in this wartime setting. Okay, so next week we dig into the book of Helaman.